Alrighty, great. Welcome back, everybody. It's good to see you. We're in the home stretch here, headed towards spring break, so I'm sure everybody's looking forward to that. Also, many of you should have gotten an email from me with your exam with my comments, where I felt there was something to be made. If you haven't gotten yours, then it'll be coming back probably later today, this evening. If you have questions about my comments or something doesn't make sense, then by all means email me or come see me in office hours, make an appointment if you can't make that time, so that we can sit and talk about whatever your question is. Okay? Questions from you guys before we get back into it and pick back up with Chapter 5. All right, cool. So last time we talked about the causal theory, and just for continuity's sake, somebody remind us, what's the basic idea there? That was Goldman's early theory from the mid-60s. So what was, and the reason I'm asking is because these things sort of build on each other. Yeah, Corey?
Was it like knowledge analyzed through causal connections?
Yeah, right. So the idea is that we're going to analyze S knows that P. We're going to drop the justification condition, right? So we get rid of the traditional third condition, which we've spent some time thinking about ways of filling that out in Chapter 4, right? And instead we just say that S knows that P, if P is true and S believes that P is true and S's belief that P is causally connected in an appropriate way to the fact in the world that P, right? And we talked about some different objections to the causal theory. And it seemed to me like it's, you never know with these things, but the people were pretty much on board and thought that the theory had some serious objections that it had to kind of confront, right? We talked about knowledge of generalizations. We talked about whether proper causal connection was either necessary or sufficient for having knowledge, right? We talked about the overdetermination case. So happy to say a little bit more if people have follow-up questions about the causal theory. If you think it's better than Feldman thinks it is, or than I think it is, then now's as good a time as any. Otherwise, I want to think for a little bit today about the tracking theory, and then probably devote most of the time to Goldman's reliabilism, his process reliabilist view. All right. And again, if you haven't posted on the discussion board, then please take time to do that. Over the break might be a good time for folks who have kind of let that slide to catch up, because it is a significant percentage of your grade. And while I will give credit for late post, it'll be significantly reduced credit too. So that could affect your grade, and you don't want to gamble on that. So the basic idea behind the tracking view. Anybody want to take a stab at it before I sort of set it up for us? It's Nozick's theory. Bob Nozick, influential philosopher, worked in a number of different areas, epistemology, also political philosophy. And he had this idea, right? We call it the tracking theory. What's the basic upshot of it? See if people have an idea here. Derek's smiling.
I guess what we know, what a person knows something based on how they tracked it as far as knowing about it.
Yeah, I mean, you've got to be, so the idea is that think of the thermometer example, right? That's the one that because again, we're sort of squarely within the realm of externalist approaches, and I went through this some last time, right? Don't let all that stuff escape you. So we talked about externalism and internalism, right? And Chapter 4 is devoted to a classical form of internalism, namely foundations theories and coherence theories, right? Whereas now we're thinking about approaches that either jettison the justification requirement altogether, or they attempt to explain justification in non-internalistic terms. What's the idea there? Well, if you're an internalist, then you think that whatever it is that makes a belief a justified belief, we're talking about epistemic justification, right, is something that's internal to the agent's cognitive perspective. This may be the easiest way to put it. Again, so there's some imprecision here, but the idea is that the justification conferring properties are ones that the agent has some sort of cognitive access to, or at least in theory, some sort of awareness of. So things like having evidence, having a good reason for thinking, it's seeming to the agent that certain perceptual experience or sensory experience, all of those are going to be things that specified, right, would be accessible to the agent from his or her internal perspective. But there's a lot of other features that a belief can have, like whether it's true, whether it's probable or not, its causal ancestry, the reliability of the process that led to it or sustains it, whether or not the cognitive system of the agent in question is functioning properly. That's not necessarily something. We'll talk about it when we get to planting his view, hopefully next time, right? So we're thinking about these externalist views, and externalists tend to, and we'll see when we get into Chapter 8 later on, talk about naturalism, because naturalized epistemology and externalism often are kind of run together, but they do often show up in the same circles. The idea is that we can think about knowing, think about the analysis of knowledge as well as what it is for a being, person, let's suppose, to know something, on the sort of model of a mechanism. So think about the thermostat in the room, right? The thermometer is another example. Nozick likes this way of thinking. Goldman likes this sort of way of thinking. And the idea is that knowers are sensitive to their environment. Obviously, a lot of these approaches, these externalist approaches, seem to do best with cases of perceptual knowledge, right? So knowledge of objects in your immediate environment, but they're intended in general to be full-blown accounts of knowledge, so they have to work for all the other kinds of knowledge that the standard view says we can have or often do have as well. Right? So you think about the thermostat, what's true about the thermostat is it's sensitive to the environment in a certain way. Right? When the environment is 72 degrees, the thermostat says 72 degrees, and when it's not 72, it says it's not. It says whatever the temperature is. And there's something appealing about this idea. Again, different folks have different intuitions, and depending on how developed yours are at this stage, which they may not be super developed, but a lot of folks are tempted by this idea, namely that human beings are sort of sophisticated, animals in a physical world. They've evolved, and these are cognitive processes that can be understood and modeled on this kind of mechanistic picture, right? So the truth tracking approach is one that gained some traction, and it's Nozick's view. And the basic idea, as I say here, right, is that tracking is a relation, knowledge is a tracking relation between a person's belief and the truth value of what is known. So we get, again, Nozick's like Goldman in the causal theory in the early work he was doing. This is a view where we're getting rid of the third condition. So the tracking condition is supposed to not be a replacement for justification or a substitute for it. It's a different thing. It's an externalistic connection, this idea of tracking. And also get around Gettier. So here's the proposal, the initial version of it. S knows P just in case, or if and only if P is true, and S believes that P is true, and S's belief tracks the truth of P. So what does it mean to track the truth? Well, here's the rough idea. A person's belief tracks the truth of a proposition equals, by definition, we're stipulating the meaning of this here. If P is true or were true, then S believes it or would believe it. And if P is false, then S either doesn't believe it or wouldn't believe it. So we've got to consider potentially some subjunctive kinds of conditionals as well in the analysis, not just indicative conditionals. And that's the initial proposal. Right? So, as Nozick says, we're going to have to make some fixes because it looks like there are some initial objections. But before we take a look at them, let me just pause for a second and see if you guys have questions, thoughts, already want to raise an objection to the theory, or maybe you think maybe you like the theory. What do people think about this tracking idea? Really? It's that bad?
Yeah, I mean, mainly
You didn't like it?
Mainly because the primary example that I give, the nose tries to base it off of the thermometer.
Yeah.
It seems like the thermometer gives, it tells what the temperature is.
Right.
It's not tracking it. It's a tracking. It's a way to track temperature, but it tells what the temperature is.
Okay.
I just don't think that's the thermometer example is a strong enough example to back this whole.
Okay.
Maybe if there's something different in the thermometer.
Yeah. Okay, fair enough. I mean, let me say Anthony, and then I'll say some more to Derek's point.
How would it work with your clock example that they
Yeah. So the broken clock example. Remember how that works, right? The person walks into the room. They form a belief about the time. They do that by looking at the clock on the wall. It says it's whatever time. It's 10 after 2. They believe it. They've got as much by way of justification as we could realistically demand. I mean, you can always, and we'll see when we get after spring break, we'll start thinking about skepticism for a big chunk of the remaining part of the semester. We could always say, and a person might, well, how do you know for sure? And did you double check? And what about, did you call Denver for the atomic time or whatever? But we don't usually demand that sort of thing. So we would say the person has a justified true belief, and under normal conditions that count as knowing the time. But then you add that the clock stopped 2 weeks ago at exactly that time. And you're supposed to have the intuition, and I say you're supposed to have because there's a lot of hard questions about how these intuitions work and the role that they play in this particular kind of approach to doing philosophy. In the old days, it was sort of taken for granted. But by old days, I mean, 40, 50 years ago maybe. But certainly over the past 20, 25 years, there's been a lot of literature by folks criticizing this kind of armchair, a priori way of trying to do philosophy and answer philosophical questions. But in any case, you're supposed to have the intuition that because the clock stopped 2 weeks ago at exactly that time, the person doesn't know. And that's a Gettier type case, right? It's a similar kind of thing. So what is Nozick's, and so we want an analysis that gets the result that the person doesn't, in fact, have knowledge, right? Well, is a person in that situation a truth tracker for the time or not? What do you, I mean, these would actually be really good, like, quiz questions or maybe discussion board questions for y'all to work through. Because one of the things I hope you do, I can't make you do it, right? Just like doing the discussion boards or doing the readings or multiple times, but trying to apply these theories to the cases. That's a helpful thing to do in terms of gauging your own understanding, because, as I've said before, you can read this stuff and it reads pretty smoothly, right? Not in a breezy way, but just, you can go through it pretty fast and think, okay, I got it. But then when you start to try to apply the theory to the cases, maybe it's easy to get tangled up and sort of get turned around on it. So in the case of the clock, the stopped clock, does it look like the person in that example is a truth tracker or not?
I guess yes, based on their own perception.
Well, so if it were that time, they would believe it, right? Because of the justification that they've got. But if it weren't that time, they'd still continue believing it were that time, right? If it were 10 minutes later or 10 minutes earlier, they'd still, because they've based their belief on the appearance of the clock on the wall. So it looks like they're not a truth tracker. They're not. So Nozick's theory actually gets that case right. The theory says in order to know you have to be a truth tracker, and it looks like the person in the stopped clock isn't a truth tracker. So the theory gives the result that that person doesn't know what time it is, and that's good news. Right? And you can sort of walk through so the idea is you have to be knowers or sensitive to their environments, not because we're just complicated thermometers. And so I don't want to take him to task too harshly for that analogy or sort of way of thinking about it. But certainly I know externalists like these kinds of analogies. The idea that, again, human beings are we're complicated mechanisms at some level. Our brains and our cognitive systems, right? And so maybe what's really going on in cases of knowledge and what's distinctive about them is there's a sensitivity to one's environment that can be kind of modeled on this mechanism, this thermometer or thermostat kind of example. I wouldn't lean on it necessarily too heavily. And it does seem that we get a handful of cases right as well. So in the case of the sheep in the field, think about that one, right? Similar kind of thing. Is the person sensitive to the proposition? If there weren't a sheep in the field, would they continue believing that there were or not? Right? So it looks like they'd believe that there weren't a sheep in the field, even though there was a sheep there, if that statue were not there, right? So it looks like, again, they're not a truth tracker. So the Nozick's theory may turn out to be, at least at first blush, a little better than I think people seem to think it was from comments and what was on the discussion boards. But that's not to say that it's an acceptable theory, right? That it's right. So there's this example that requires a kind of tweak, a kind of revision to the tracking theory. It's the lucky knowledge case. Anybody want to, just so we can get it out there and in front of us, anybody want to read that one for us? It's at the bottom of 87. Thanks, Ian.
Black is hard at work in her office. From time to time, she looks up from her desk and computer to stretch her neck. On one such occasion, she happens to glance out the window towards the street. Just at that moment, she sees her mugging on the street. She has a clear view of the event. She was a witness.
All right, thanks. So in this case, we want to say that Black knows that a mugging has occurred, and yet it looks like the tracking condition's not satisfied. Why not? Well, could have easily happened that she just failed to look out the window at that crucial moment, in which case the mugging would have still been taking place, but she wouldn't have believed it. Right? So this is the case of what it's calling lucky knowledge. So the first thing to do is just make sure you see how these counterexamples are supposed to make trouble for the theory. And it's not always easy to do. As I say, sometimes you can get into them and sort of overthink them or read too much in and get kind of tangled up and twisted around in it. But that's one kind of an example. So it looks like Black does not have knowledge, or does have knowledge, but she's not a truth tracker for that proposition. And then there's the grandma case. Anybody want to take that one for us? Yeah, thanks, Corey.
Old Phil grandma sees grandson Johnny playing happily before her. Knows that Johnny is well and playing happily. Suppose Johnny were sick. The family would tell grandma that Johnny is well and playing happily, but that he's doing this at a friend's house. They did not want to make grandma worried. So if Johnny were sick, she would still believe that he is well.
Right. So people see how that one is supposed to create trouble for the tracking theory as well, because you have to be sensitive both ways. So if the proposition were true, you'd believe that it's true, and if it weren't true under whatever varied circumstances, you wouldn't continue believing it. You have to be sensitive in roughly the way that the thermometer or the thermostat is to the conditions in the room. So the grandmother sees Johnny playing, and he's well, and everything's fine, and she believes it, no problem there. But if it weren't true, she would continue to keep believing it. Why is that? Well, because they wouldn't want to worry her. So presumably there'd be some story about how he's fine, he's just at a friend's house or whatever. This looks like it creates trouble for the view. And so we end up with a revision of the theory, right? And I don't have it up here projected, but you can take a look at it. This is TT star in the middle of 88 here. S knows P if and only if P is true, S believes it, and then we get two conditions here. S used method M to form belief P, and 4, when S uses method M to form beliefs about P, S's beliefs track the truth. So Nozick introduces, and again Feldman puts in a footnote that he's simplified it a fair amount just to avoid unnecessary complication, but Nozick's original version, if you wanted to look at it, is complicated. I don't know that it makes too much of a difference to the the conclusion that Feldman wants to ultimately have us see here. But this idea of sticking within a certain method, not switching methods. Let me see if I can get some of the glare off of that for us. Is it a little better? So the idea is that, well, there's been a method switch here because initially Grandma forms the belief by visual observation, perception, and then the second time around she doesn't form the belief in that same way. She forms it because she's told, right? Not because she's looking or whatever it is. You have to figure out how to individuate these methods becomes, in some ways, a similar precursor problem to the generality problem for reliabilism. So how does all this work? Well, seems like we're still going to have some problems, right? Because it looks like, at least one argument is that, or one objection is that tracking still doesn't look like it's going to be necessary for knowledge, because it seems like a modified version of the lucky knowledge case will still can be used against even this proposal. So the idea here is, we can just read what he says. When Black uses the method, this is at the top of 89, when Black uses the method of glancing out the window to form beliefs about whether there's a mugging occurring, her beliefs track the truth. That is, if there were a mugging, she typically would believe that there is, and if there were no mugging, she typically would believe that there's not. But again, it looks like if the mugging just happens to be taking place slightly out of view or out of sight, it'd still be true, but she wouldn't believe it. But it seems like she's using the same method, which is glancing out the window. Now, Feldman notes that defenders, proponents of this kind of view, might try to, introduce some epicycles or make some moves to try to get out of that counterexample. But in general, it seems to me like that's a problem. And then there's the second objection due to Saul Kripke, the absurd barns. I don't know if people got that or not, or what people thought about that one. But the idea is that we're in fake barn country again, right, where the fake sheep and the fake barns are. And we've got a bunch of fake barns mixed in and a handful of real ones. Turns out that the only real ones are the red ones, but all the other ones are fakes, right, the other colors. And the puzzle here is it looks like the tracking theorist is stuck with this kind of undesirable result, namely that you can know that there's a red barn in the field, but you can't know that there's a barn in the field. And the reason why is because you're a truth tracker for the red barns, but you're not a truth tracker for barns in general. Right? In other words, when there is a barn there, you'd believe it, but when there's not a barn there, you still believe it, because the fake barns are, they would do just as well. But of course, you're never going to get it wrong when it's a red barn. This is a problem, right? Because knowing that it's a red barn entails knowing that it's barn. So it looks like you're going to run into trouble with something like the closure principle as well, which seems like bad news. So, what's the conclusion on all of this? Well, hopefully you've had a chance to think about it and you've read it and you know that just seems like these are some pretty substantial, pretty serious problems for tracking. Right? Are there ways to fix it? Perhaps. These are, and if any of this interests you, then that's certainly fair game for a paper idea as well. So, thoughts, questions on any of that part? Otherwise, I'm going to move us on to process reliabilism and see if people think that's a better idea. So, in terms of the evolution of these views, Goldman's work in the late 60s was primarily on the causal theory. So he publishes Causal Theory of Knowing around 67. And then up through the 70s, the late 70s, he starts to jettison the causal theory in the face of some of the kinds of objections we've already considered. And but he's still an externalist, and he's an advocate for a kind of naturalistic approach to epistemology as well. And that's when he starts working on what would eventually become reliabilism. Now, of the four externalist views, and again, these aren't all of them. There's hybrids, and it's an evolving, dynamic sort of area in philosophy. But of the four approaches we're considering, my sense is that reliabilism is pretty much the dominant one, even to this day. And maybe Plantinga's proper functionalism is in the mix too. But certainly, process reliabilism, I think, is sort of the 800-pound gorilla, if you will, in among these sort of externalist approaches. And the basic idea, again, is, well, what is it in virtue of which justified beliefs are justified? And Goldman's answer is, well, it's that they generally tend to produce true beliefs, whereas unjustified beliefs don't. Right? So this is a little bit different because we're not getting rid of the justification condition. We're still going to keep that. We're just giving an analysis of what the justification condition amounts to. Right? And so the idea is that justification is a matter of one's belief being produced by a reliable belief-forming process. So what are some of the intuitive examples he gives? Well, of reliable ones. Of course, he's going to want perception in there, even though not all perceptual beliefs are reliably formed, of course. Memory, another one that's supposed to be on the list of sanctioned, approved, reliable belief-forming processes. Good reasoning, introspection, and none of these is in fact, they don't have to claim, and it's good that they don't, right? Because it'd be implausible that these things are infallible. Just that, in general, beliefs that are produced by these sorts of processes are, on balance, justified, and it's in virtue of their reliability that they are. What about the sort of putative examples of unreliable belief-forming processes? Well, hasty generalization, so kind of quickly generalizing from small sample, not enough information. Wishful thinking, having no real good what I think of as an evidentialist is having no real good reason for thinking something's true other than that you'd like it to be true. Confused reasoning, guesswork, and so on. So the idea, again, is that the processes that are on the approved list, the ones we want to be able to say in general, again, this is all defeasible, but when things are working in the right way, generally result in justified beliefs, are the ones that are reliable, and these others aren't. So here's an initial version of reliabilism for us to consider. So S justifiably believes that P, if and only if S's belief that P is caused by a reliable belief-forming process. And presumably, of course, you'd have to add for the whole picture that P is true, and S believes that P is true, and then S has justification cashed out in terms of this sort of initial pass at reliabilism. And then there'd be something to get around Gettier, presumably, as well. So again, this isn't getting rid of justification, but rather a kind of externalist way of sort of specifying what justification amounts to. So what do people think about this? There'll be another version of it, but thoughts, questions on the basic idea, at least? Yeah.
I think we're running into this thing with the proper response and what exactly a reliable belief-forming process is.
Yeah.
Like that's undefined, so you have to find what that is for each case.
Is this sort of anticipating one of the things Feldman's going to say at the end of the section?
No, it's just a general
Okay. Yeah. No, if it were, that'd be okay too. I mean, I think there is this worry, but I just want to make sure I'm understanding what you're concerned about. You're just saying it's going to be hard to sort of specify which processes are in fact reliable and which ones aren't.
If you look at it after the fact and you say that
Yeah.
this one was true, therefore that this is reliable, that's just backwards reasoning.
Yeah. No, I agree, and that does sound a little bit like part of what's going on with the generality problem, which we'll talk a little bit about that, and whether that constitutes a fatal blow to the theory. I think Feldman's he's pretty modest about these things. His contribution on this literature, and I think the way he says it at the end of this section is fair enough. That doesn't mean that they're not things that the reliabilists can say back. They can, but it might just be that the theory is not filled out in enough detail at this point for us to really be able to. It's not theoretically adequate. I'll show you a reconstruction of essentially that objection when we get to it. So here's one kind of objection, that the notion of reliability is vague. Right? How reliable does a belief-forming process have to be in order for the resulting beliefs to be justified? You might think that sounds like a pretty good objection. Feldman actually doesn't think so. Anybody remember why not? You can think. Compare it with what evidentialists are going to say, because we know that in general justification's going to come in degrees. You can have more or less by way of your justification for a belief, and so if you're an internalist of the evidentialist variety, then what you want to say is that a belief is justified insofar as it fits a person's total evidence. The better the fit, the more justified. Right? So if you've got nearly conclusive evidence supporting believing P, then P is highly justified for you. But suppose that your evidence is only 60-40. Again, the numbers are kind of meaningless, but you're considering the proposition that it's going to rain on Saturday. And it's still a pretty good ways away. It's a ways out. And we know that the weather forecasts are, they often get things wrong, especially when they're trying to do it a long way out. So they say there's a 60% chance that it'll rain. What should you believe concerning the proposition that it'll rain on Saturday? Well, I'm inclined to say you're justified in believing that it'll rain, but, don't bet the farm on it. Right? You've got 60% of the evidence. Suppose that's all the only information you've got are these numbers from the Weather Center. Then I think you're justified, but it's again not something that you want to believe, with utter and complete conviction. So it seems like the notion of evidence and having evidence and of evidential fit between a proposition and a person's body of evidence, that's similarly kind of a vague concept. And I think Feldman takes a moment to kind of point out that while it does seem right that this notion of reliability is vague, that doesn't seem to be a knockdown, drag-out problem for the view, because having evidence looks like it's going to be, or having adequate evidence. Right? How much evidence do you need before you're justified in believing something? Is kind of the question, right? So, what about? Here's another kind of thing that he talks a little bit about. Suppose that Smith reasons using modus ponens, right? So P is true, and if P is true, then Q is true, and comes to the conclusion that Q forms that belief. Could still turn out that Q is false, if it turned out that the premises are false. So no guarantees there, even though modus ponens is an example of good reasoning. You want to be able to reason using affirming the antecedent, right? So what's the sort of fix for this? Well, Goldman never one to shy away from revising his theory. He talks about two different kinds of processes. So the belief-dependent processes and belief-independent processes. And the belief-independent ones are the ones that are sort of the target for a lot of the subsequent objections and people going through the literature. Belief-independent processes are, think about perception. So it'd be sort of similar to what the foundationalists are going to say about basic beliefs, ones that are spontaneously acquired in properly in response to one's experience. So I see the thermos on the table, and as a result of visual perception, I get the belief, right? It's a belief-independent process. Setting aside, of course, that I have to have stored beliefs in memory about things that look like that and what they're called, that's a term, let all that kind of go to the side. Then there are going to be belief-dependent processes. These are ones like reasoning, where you've got some beliefs already and you're going to use those as the inputs to the process that are going to generate additional beliefs. Okay? So here's what we'll call R star, this sort of subsequent statement of the theory. If S's belief in P at T results from a belief-independent process that's reliable, then the belief is justified. If the belief at P results from a belief-dependent process that's conditionally reliable, and the beliefs the process operates on are themselves already justified, then the belief, this is to get around the puzzle of, well, how are we going to keep from having modus ponens or modus tollens turn out to be an unreliable belief-forming process, even though we know that those are examples of good reasoning, right? Those are legitimate inferences, but they're only as good as the inputs. So if the premises are false, then all bets are off on the conclusion, right? And then the only way that you can get justified is by satisfying one or the other of these two conditions. This is a kind of catch-all clause at the end. And he talks a little bit about recursive definitions. If people have questions about that, I'm happy to say some stuff. So we end up with this version of the theory, and we've got some different objections. These are kind of fun to think about, so I hope you guys will have something to say. Everybody's sleepy. It's sunny, it's the afternoon. All right, so the first one I want to think about here is this brain in a vat objection. And we'll talk a lot about this too when we get back after spring break and start talking about skepticism. Anybody want to read this one for us? So this is supposed to be an objection designed to show that reliabilism is false and that reliability isn't necessary for having a justified belief. This is over on 94 in the middle. Somebody want to read that one for us? Thanks. Yeah, so the only thing is we got brain. Switches it around, right? So it's Brian and brain. Yeah, all right. So brain is so we're in a fairly exotic, thought experiment, and we'll get to use this idea of a brain in a vat a fair amount, as I say, for the remainder of the semester. So how many people are familiar with brains in vats? Talked about this in other classes a little bit? Jamie shaking her head, yeah. Okay. But not everybody is. So a little bit of background on these brains in vats. The brain in a vat hypothesis, or as people sometimes call it, the BIV hypothesis, is a kind of updated version of essentially Descartes' evil demon. So if you're familiar with what's going on in meditations, go back to your days reading Descartes. We've got this possibility that gets announced at the end of Meditation 1, where Descartes says that even if there's some way to, some conclusive indication that would allow me to distinguish between dreaming and waking life, suppose there is, even though he doesn't seem to be able to find one. That's his second reason for doubt, right? The possibility that all of this could be taking place in a dream. He says, so suppose that there is some way we can distinguish. Even so, how do I know that I'm not under the influence of or the victim of an evil genius that gets translated differently in different versions? Some people say evil demon, evil genius, mad scientist. Doesn't really matter, but for the sake of the thought experiment, suppose that some being, right, this evil demon, is very powerful and has it as part of his goal to deceive Descartes, to deceive each of us about our beliefs about the external world, such that every time we try to get it right, we make a mistake and we get it wrong. So an updated version of this idea was put forward by Hilary Putnam, the famous Harvard philosopher who passed away a few years ago, unfortunately. Putnam made a lot of contributions to a wide number of different areas in philosophy. And one of his contributions is this idea of a brain in a vat, in a paper, not surprisingly called Brains in Vats. And what Putnam says is, imagine that what we have is an explanted brain, so normal functioning human brain, that has been kept alive in this giant vat, this big container of nutrient fluid. Again, this is an exotic thought experiment, so you have to imagine, this is neuroscience far, far away from where we are right now, presumably. But the fact that it's exotic isn't going to be a mark against it for our purposes. We've seen exotic examples and crazy ones before. So you've got this brain that's being kept alive in this giant vat of nutrient fluid, and there are electrodes, let's suppose, however many it would take, a lot, I'm guessing, but electrodes attached to the surface of the brain, and these are all then running back to a bunch of supercomputers, or some big computer that's programmed, and the computer is programmed to simulate all the impulses that would normally be taking place in the brain, all that neural activity. If the brain were in fact really in a room right now with other people experiencing the real thing. The problem is that the brain's just a disembodied brain in a vat, and this program is running. So you think that you're in a room with other people right now, and you get it right. The brain thinks the same thing, but the brain gets it wrong. The brain's some graduate student's dissertation research project in the bottom of the psych building in one of the basements there or something. Right? So this raises a lot of different kinds of questions, and it's been addressed a lot in the literature. Some of it has to do with Putnam's own solution to the problem, what he wants to say about it, and with this idea known as semantic externalism. This is a view within the philosophy of language that says, in part, what determines the meaning of a concept are the causal connections associated with competent speakers' use of the concept. So it might be that you can't even think a thought about water if you've never actually been in touch with water. We can do it, presumably, because assuming skepticism's false, we've all come into contact with water. Part of the meaning of that concept is that stuff. If that's the case, then you might think that, hey, this provides the beginnings of a response to skepticism, because clearly I can know what thought I'm thinking, and if part of the content of my thought is that I've been in causal contact with an actual external world that includes things like water, and tables, and chairs, then maybe that's some way of responding to the skeptic. Of course, not everyone's going to buy this. There's been quite a bit of backlash to that idea. So that was part of Putnam's motivation, was to develop this sort of philosophy of language line of response to the skeptic. For our purposes, though, we want to think about the brain in a vat in connection with reliabilism, and whether or not the possibility of a brain in a vat and what we want to say about it shows that reliabilism is a bad idea, right? Whether the theory can hold up to it. So, again, the way the scenario is supposed to work is we've got Brian, normal person, lots of all the normal experiences, and then we've got Brain, Putnam-style, disembodied brain in a vat, and they're having exactly the same sorts of experiences from their internal perspective. Looks the same to each of them. One gets it right, let's suppose, with high reliability, or maybe all the time, however you want to do it. And then the other one, Brain, sadly, is mistaken, gets it wrong. Now, intuitions on these kind of things are gonna be all over the map. It's hard to generalize about them. What do people think? Maybe before we look at the objection, one question to you guys is, what should we say about Brain's beliefs? Is Brain justified or not in his beliefs? Because that will determine whether, that's going to be crucial to determining whether or not you think this is a good objection to reliabilism or not. Yes, Anthony.
I guess Brain doesn't really have a reason to believe that he isn't having those experiences.
Right, yeah, and we're supposed to, and again, there have been a whole bunch of different versions of the BIV hypothesis and they've kind of dominated a lot of this literature on skepticism in the past 20, 25 years for different reasons, depending on what the authors were trying to do. In some cases, people are trying to make some points in philosophy of language, and some people are worried about some metaphysical issues. Others are concerned about skepticism and the implications for that. But yeah, I suppose again, the case, we can add details if we need to, if you think it's under-described in various ways. There have been some modifications of the BIV hypothesis where, suppose you've always been a disembodied brain in a vat. You've never actually had a brain inside a skull and been a normal person. That'd be one possibility. Another one is, suppose that you're kind of getting switched back and forth. They often talk about slow switching in connection with twin Earth, where you're moving somebody back and forth between Earth and twin Earth, holding various things constant and trying to tease out the implications mostly for views in the philosophy of language. But similar kind of thing you could imagine for the brain as well. So yeah, I think we're supposed to think that Brain has no reason to believe things are amiss. Right? So no reason for thinking that that there's any funny business. In part because if you're somebody who's sympathetic to skepticism, then you want to be able to say, well, look, for all you know right now, you could be a disembodied brain in a vat. All the experience, based on all the evidence you've got, your evidence isn't good enough to rule out that possibility. And if you can't rule out the possibility of being a brain in a vat right now, then why are you justified to the level of knowing that you're in a room with other people? That's the concern. So, does that help any, Anthony, or? So what? I guess one question is whether or not people think as described, this is a case where both of them are justified in believing the same things are true. If you think that they are both justified, then I think it's going to go one way. If you for whatever reason have the intuition that, well, no, Brian's fine, he's justified, but Brain, for some reason, he isn't justified, then you're going to have to say something different, I think. So here's the objection, as Feldman sort of spells it out. If reliabilism's true, then a belief's justified for a person at a time if and only if it's produced by a reliable belief-forming process. The external world beliefs of the brain in a vat are not reliably produced. In fact, they seem to be completely unreliable. Every time the brain in a vat tries to form a belief about the way things are, he gets it, sadly gets it wrong, just like the hapless victim of Descartes' evil demon. So if 1 and 2 are both true, then it looks like the external world beliefs of the brain and the vat are not justified. But they are justified. Why is that? Well, because the same evidence principle suggests that in 2 cases, one the normal or typical case and one the unusual case, if the folks in these examples have exactly the same evidence available to them, then they're either both justified in believing it, they're both justified in believing that it's not the case, or they're both justified in suspending judgment. What they ought to do is suspend. Justified to the same degrees. So that would, if this is right, we've got a kind of reductio thing going on here. Hopefully people can stop me if you need me to say anything about the structure of the argument, but hopefully you can see that we've got a contradiction here. 2 seems to be right, so the only place left to go is with 1. Right? So R is not true. Get rid of 1 as a result. So the argument's valid. If all the premises were true, the conclusion would have to be true, and all the action, of course, is going to center around the premises. So what do people think? Everybody convinced that they can't tell right now whether they're in a classroom with their classmates or a disembodied Putnam-style brain in a vat? If so, then I've done my job. Just kidding. I'm anti-skeptically inclined, but having said that, that doesn't mean I take it for granted that I think we should be pretty cautious in a lot of our claims. So, thoughts? Yeah, sure.
So getting rid of 1 negates this objection?
Say that?
Getting rid of 1 negates this objection?
Well, so what happens is that what you're going to have to do, if you're a reliabilist, you've got to somehow insist that you got to make the case that the brain in a vat's beliefs presumably aren't justified because they're not reliably produced. I'm appealing to this sort of this strong internalist kind of intuition here, which is coming out of chapter 4 in the same evidence principle. The idea that, well, look, I mean, what should the brain in a vat believe about his experiences? Brain. He's having experiences as of, giving a lecture right now in a classroom with other people. Seems to me like it's reasonable for a brain to believe that that's true, rather than suspend judgment or disbelieve it. And so it's hard for me to see why the brain isn't justified. Seems like the brain is. Of course, the beliefs are unreliable. Now, part of what will come out a little bit later, and Feldman notes this, which I think is a nice kind of subtle move on his part, is that what's driving our intuitions that these people are either using the same processes or different processes. What is the relevant belief-forming process here? Because on the one hand, you say, well, the belief-forming process that generates the brain in a vat's beliefs, it's unreliable. So it's no good because reliability is the mark of justification. The belief-forming process that generates Brian's beliefs, it's as good as any of ours. It's reliable, not 100%, it's not infallible, but certainly if there aren't any good reasons for thinking otherwise, if there aren't any defeaters, let's suppose, then you get justified. But what makes us think that? Seems like if you specify it one way, it looks like they're using different processes. The one's using a process that's a belief-forming process that's causally initiated by a computer program that sends impulses to the surface of the brain directly and simulates the experience, whereas the normal person their perceptions are caused in the regular way by actually having causal interaction with those things. So if you specify the processes that way, maybe then it looks like they're not using the same belief-forming process. But if you think about it from their own internal perspective, it looks the same way to each of them. Seems like they're reasoning in the same way as far as they could either one of them tell. So this is part of something that has to be confronted as reliabilists struggle to deal with this objection. I don't know if that was helping Derek or not, because it seemed like you had more you want to say about this argument.
No, I mean, because I'm believe that the brain in the bank is not really going to.
So you think the brain's justified? What Brain ought to believe is the same stuff that Brian ought to believe. It's just sad the one's going to turn out to get it right and the other one's going to get it wrong. But the brain's not doing anything epistemically remiss or untoward or anything like that. It's believing as he ought. Yeah, I mean, if you have that intuition, then good. I don't know what more to say about it. Okay, Corey, you got that puzzled look on your face.
Come back, I was trying to think.
All right.
Trying to word one kind of thinking.
What other folks think? Anything bad? Well, while you're thinking about it, let me move us on to it. So, what's the point of this objection? Well, it would be that reliability isn't necessary for justified belief. You can have justified beliefs even though they're produced by unreliable belief-forming processes. Now, keep in mind that, I mean, this doesn't mean that reliability isn't a good thing for a belief-forming process to have. I mean, in the same way that causal connections are important, and truth tracking is not a bad thing either, and reliability among one's belief-forming processes. These are all. So I want to be clear as an internalist that I'm not saying there's nothing of value going on in any of these externalist approaches, but just that, again, if there's supposed to be analyses of our concept of epistemic justification, as in this case, or proper functionalism, or if the proposal is just to get rid of justification altogether, as is the case with the causal theory or the tracking theory, then I think we got a problem. Yeah.
I would say that maybe I feel like these non-evidentialist beliefs are probably better suited to assist, I guess, evidentialist beliefs in some way.
Yeah. Like
instead of being like theories on themselves, standing by themselves, they should probably like help out tiny little cases.
So they're sort of a supplement to what evidentialism says. Yeah, I mean, I can see the temptation in going that way because it seems to make things better for the externalist approaches. But just at least as far as what they've gone in print saying is that they're trying to get away from this idea of evidentialism because, well, I think there's a lot of different motivations. I mean, in some cases they're just research programs that people are excited about, and it's their baby, and they want to defend it. They want to see how far they can go with it. In other cases, I think that there are folks out there that are hostile to the traditional approach to doing epistemology, which is this kind of armchair consulting intuitions, largely a priori, right? I haven't had you guys reading anything from neuroscience or cognitive science or psychology this semester. I don't have a bunch of reserves out there online asking you to, get up to speed on the latest science regarding our brains, how they work, perception. None of that, right? There's no lab. So the approach that we've taken so far has been one of this kind of armchair, often called armchair philosophy. And there are people that are kind of hostile to that idea, they think, for different reasons. And I mean, it's stuff I like to think about, this sort of larger debate within epistemology over the sort of future and fate of traditional philosophical methodology, this idea of analyzing concepts, trying to state necessary and sufficient conditions. So there's that kind of thing playing in the background as well. So we haven't looked at naturalistic approaches yet, but we will eventually. And certainly Goldman and Plantinga interestingly enough, kind of curiously, both of those, as well as the causal theory and the tracking theory, are touted as examples of naturalized epistemology. So that's one kind of motivation. What about another objection here? Well, if you come back and think about the brain in the vat if we need to, but here's another one. So the brain in the vat is supposed to show that reliability isn't necessary for having a justified belief. You can be justified despite the fact that the belief's produced by an unreliable belief-forming process. Over on 95, we've got this example of accidental or unknown reliability. This is, again, a relatively well-known, influential thought experiment due to Larry Bonjour. We've seen Bonjour before in connection with coherence theories. So Bonjour and Keith Lair are two of the major advocates, or at least were. Bonjour's changed his mind as a foundationalist now, but for a long time he was pushing the coherence theory in his book, The Structure of Empirical Knowledge. And he has this example of Norman and clairvoyance. This is at the bottom of 95. So Norman, under certain conditions, which you usually obtain, is a completely reliable clairvoyant with respect to certain kinds of subject matter. He possesses no evidence or reasons of any kind for or against the general possibility of such a cognitive power, or for or against the thesis that he possesses it. One day Norman comes to believe that the president is in New York City, though he has no evidence either for or against this belief. In fact, the belief is true and results from his clairvoyant power under circumstances in which it is completely reliable. So here's a reconstruction of that, what we could do with that example, turn it into an objection. And this, again, is something that I encourage you to do just for future reference in the next exam, if there's an opportunity, but certainly in your paper when the time comes. And I'll encourage people to do rough drafts, and I'll be revising the calendar over spring break and get us figure out what the second half of the semester is going to look like, since we've kind of slipped a little behind. But I'll get that out there and have it posted and put it in an announcement for you. So here's a way to take those considerations in this particular case and turn them into an argument, premises leading to a conclusion against the view. So if R is true, reliabilism is true, then any belief that results from a reliable belief-forming process is justified. Premise 2, accidentally true beliefs can result from a reliable belief-forming process. Therefore, accidentally true beliefs are justified or can be justified. But it's not the case that accidentally true beliefs are justified. So reliabilism is false. Again, the arguments intended to be valid. And, I just try to throw things out for you that'll be helpful for future reference. When you're explaining in your own writing, at least for me in this course, when you're explaining these things, don't assume that I already know what all's going on. It's nice to kind of have you walk me through it. I know it's tempting to think, well, I don't need to say that the argument's valid and show that I know what that means. And, well, yeah, I get it, and I do know those things, but the point is for you to demonstrate to me that you know how you're using this language and that you're using it the right way. So more is, I guess, preferable to less, even though it may seem to you to be unnecessary. It helps me feel a little bit better as I read through your work. And this goes for the discussion boards as well. I mean, if people are going to use terminology that's technical, it's not a bad thing to include a sentence explaining what these things mean. Just even for me as well as your classmates who have to read these things. So we've got a valid argument, and the conclusion is that reliabilism is false. What do people think about Norman and his unknown, reliable, clairvoyant power? I mean, if these objections, I'd say either one of these, the brain in a vat or Norman in the clairvoyance case, if either of these objections works, then they're pretty significant problems for reliabilists. right? They're going to have to say something to get around. I mean, this kind of goes right to the heart of the theory, since it is supposed to give us a set of logically necessary and sufficient conditions for what justification is. If you don't have to have reliability in order to be justified, and if having reliability doesn't guarantee that you are justified, then is there any interesting philosophical connection between reliability and epistemic justification, even if we can grant that in general it's nice to have beliefs that are reliably formed? Just like in general it's nice to have beliefs that are causally connected to the facts in the world that make them true, if we're talking about perceptual beliefs, or beliefs that are sensitive to the truth values of the propositions in cases where that makes sense. Yeah.
So I guess I'm getting lost for Norman's in the clairvoyance case, the process
Yeah.
which he's using, because it
Right.
seems to me that I mean, I get the idea of being clairvoyance, but like
Yeah.
it seems that you wouldn't necessarily you would probably lump that in with the bad, like hasty generalization.
Yeah, so the bad guys. Yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
like a hasty generalization.
Right.
So that it's kind of unclear to me if that
Yeah.
I think the brain in the back resides for.
You feel better about that one?
Yeah, I don't know. Normal one is a little bit. Like what
Yeah.
process is that?
Well, and I think that's so. This is a good segue into the generality problem, which is the last little thing that he kind of. This all kind of builds up to that, because obviously the erstwhile reliabilist who's wanting to defend their view against these kinds of objections, they're gonna start searching around trying to find. They need to come up with the relevant process, belief forming process, to then get the theory to give the right result. So maybe if it turns out that Brain and Brian are using the same belief forming process, and maybe Brain's is reliable not in virtue of getting it right, but it's reliable in virtue of being the one that Brian uses, and Brian's in the normal world. Now this may sound like we're just piling on, epicycles here or something to save the theory, but Goldman actually kind of says that later on. I mean, we don't really get to talk about it in what we've got here, but he does. Not too long after this sort of objection came out, he publishes another article where he talks about normal world's reliabilism, is what he calls it. So we get to just kind of summarily dismiss the demon worlds. We're not talking about the beliefs formed by people that are, in these demon worlds. We're talking about these normal worlds. And so maybe if the way we're supposed to figure out what process Brain is using is by looking at the one that Brian's using, and since Brian's is reliable, then maybe, or Brian's is justified, then maybe Brain's counts as justified in virtue of that, kind of piggybacking on. Likewise with Norman and the clairvoyance, right? I agree with you. I mean, intuitively, clairvoyance isn't on the isn't high on the list of the good ones. It seems more like a kind of sketchy one. It's a paranormal ability that's dubious at best, maybe. So what do we want to say about what the belief-forming process is there? Well, I mean, the reliabilist could dig around in their bag of tricks and say, well, hold on a minute. Maybe the belief-forming process there is the process of forming beliefs when I have no good reason for thinking that they're true, and beliefs formed using that process are not reliable, and so, it gets the right result for that reason. Even though he's getting it right all the time, the process type that's being invoked, that's being used, is what's going to turn out to be important. So this gets us to the very end, and I think fun stuff to think about, hard stuff too. This is the generality problem. So all this work was going on in 78 and up into the early 80s. By 84, Goldman had published his magnum opus, which is a big, thick book called Epistemology and Cognition, which is one of the sort of initial salvos in this debate about naturalized epistemology. And he tries to make the case in the book that his project is an example of a thoroughgoing naturalized epistemology. Curious aside, the first half of the book is just straightforward conceptual analysis. Looks just like the kind of stuff we've been doing. The second half of the book looks like cognitive science. Doesn't look like philosophy at all. So I think that was it was a little bit. I think he was a little ambitious there in his claims. But in any case, that's 84. By 85, Feldman publishes a paper then in the Monist called Reliability and Justification, where he brings up this problem, and it subsequently kind of gets his name attached to it, which is, I think it's a really nice problem to have your name on. It's called the generality problem. And so the idea is that it seems like the relevant things for assessing reliability are belief-forming process types. So there's this distinction between a type and a token that hopefully people are familiar with. So the tokens are particular individual instances. Okay? So if I write cat, so did I write one word or 3 words? So that's not a trick, right? I mean, one word 3 times or something. So I can enumerate the instances if I wanted to. So if I'm counting by the token, I've got 1, 2, 3 instances, but there's just this one type. Why is that? Well, because the word can be individuated or, identified by the letter sequence, and any two words that have the exact same letter sequence and are part of the same language family are the same word, same type. So in any case, we've got this distinction between types and tokens, and it can't be that the token's the relevant belief-forming process, because a token only happens one time. So the belief-forming process that's leading to your belief right now, that you're listening to a lecture, that's a one-time thing. The type, whatever the type of process is, given some way of specifying it, that could be repeatable, right? But the actual individual sequence of events that's leading to your particular belief at a given time, that's a token. That's a belief-forming process token, and it's either 100% reliable in the case that it issues in a true belief, or it's 100% unreliable in the case that it issues in a false one, right? Assuming the belief's either true or it's not true. Well, that's not going to help us any, because that collapses the distinction between justification and truth. Then we're just back to saying all true beliefs are justified and all false beliefs aren't, and that's not a result that reliabilists want, right? So it looks like the right way to think about reliability is in terms of belief-forming process types, and seems like at this point we just don't have enough information. The real thing is to get the reliabilist to kind of pin them down and say, okay, tell me more about how we determine the relevant belief-forming processes, and then I'll give you a case. But what I'm not going to do is I'm not going to give you these hypothetical cases without you giving me any information on how we think about reliability, and then you dig around in the bag of tricks until you can come up with some gerrymandered process that reverse engineers the result. That's cheating. That's not the way the game's supposed to be played, right? So there's a puzzle here about whether the reliabilist can say anything in defense of this idea of figuring out what the relevant belief-forming process types are. Now Feldman doesn't give this argument. I made it up for him, just taking what he said. But again, a kind of an example of what I'd like to be able to see you guys do. And I just call this a sort of theoretical adequacy argument against reliabilism. And again, it doesn't show that reliabilism is hopeless and can't be made to work, but it does present a serious problem. And I think it's worth noting that a lot of graduate students try to write dissertations solving the generality problem, not at the University of Rochester, at other places. And it's an unsolved problem. So it's kind of like a Gettier problem, but not maybe quite as significant, but a serious problem for reliabilism. So reliabilism is theoretically adequate only if there's a systematic and non-arbitrary way of determining what the relevant belief-forming process types are in every case. In any particular case, a person's belief will be an instance of arbitrarily many different process types with differing degrees of reliability. If that's true, then it doesn't look like there is. Maybe there just is no systematic way, no non-arbitrary, non-ad hoc way of figuring out what the relevant belief-forming process types are. And if that's the case, then reliabilism is just not theoretically adequate. In other words, it's an interesting idea, but we can't really evaluate it because we don't have the information we need. So I'll stop with that for today. Thanks, folks. Next time, any residual questions on this, and we'll talk about Plantinga's proper functionalism. Thanks.